was basically their overlords. And Rome would not let any kind of capital punishment be exercised in any of the places where they were without Roman consent. And the only way that they could get Roman consent was they had to somehow make it appear that the individual who was on trial was actually violating Roman crime or Roman law. And it had to be profound for it to be a capital crime. It's in many ways, I would compare it to our system of justice, in which if there is some kind of a crime that is committed, particularly if it is something that brings the death sentence, it has to be something so egregious that it would do that. It may not necessarily be a crime worthy of death and they could be locked up in prison, maybe even for the rest of their life. But to die, that is to be killed, it has to be some kind of an extremely egregious crime in order to be able to make that possible. And so the Jewish law, the Romans care nothing about. And so they know that they're not going to get Jesus executed based upon the fact, that is, Rome is not going to execute Jesus based upon the fact that they've considered him to be a blasphemer and considered him to be a false prophet. And so they have to come up with some other way in order to be able to see to it that Jesus is actually executed by the Romans. So what was the ploy that they used? What did they have to do in order to convince Pilate? And they never did convince him, as we will see a little bit further on. But they had to do the best they could to convince Pilate that Jesus had done something so egregious as it relates to Roman law that he therefore was worthy of execution. A king, that's right. Now, think about that. Rome, at this point in history, has dominated the world. And I mean all of the world, at least what we would know about as far as history is concerned. They are from Spain all the way across into the Middle Eastern, even beyond the Middle Eastern places. They're all over the Mediterranean, all over the northern part of Africa. Rome controls everything. And now, if there's somebody that comes along and makes the declaration that they are a king, who is that a threat to as far as Roman law was concerned? To the Caesar, to the one who truly was their ruler, their dictator. And so that would be an egregious crime, because essentially what it boils down to would be everything from insurrection to starting a revolution to the overthrow of the Caesar himself. And that was considered to be traitorous. And consequently, the one who was convicted of something like that would in fact be killed. And he would be killed in the most obscene way. And that was through crucifixion. And crucifixion, I don't know if you've studied much or read much about it, but crucifixion was just a horrible, horrible way to die. Because it was not meant to kill you initially. It was meant to kill you slowly. And so the design of it was torture. And why do you think the Romans would take an individual? And by the way, these were very public executions. It was said that when Pompey originally went into Rome, which was back in around 60 BC, and he first conquered Jerusalem, one of the things that he did, and this is when, by the way, Rome then became the overlords of Israel. When Pompey did that, he would take people and put them on crosses outside the city area so that as people are walking in, they would see all of these poor, miserable people hanging upon a cross. And what do you think the purpose of that was for? I'm sorry? Okay. And how would it deter it? I mean, well, okay, let me put it this way. Public executions are not done anymore, at least not in this country. And if you are to witness a public execution, that is, you are forced to see that just by virtue of the way you live your life, you're walking into a city and you see crosses all up and down a road, and there are people hanging on them, and they're hanging on them in a way in which, first of all, you know, the pictures that are oftentimes that are created about crucifixion is that the individual on the cross will at least have a loincloth on. Well, the fact was they were naked. There was nothing on them. And they were obviously pinned up there on a cross. They were there, in many cases they were tied. In a lot of cases they were actually nailed like Jesus was. So there was this pinning, if you will, upon a cross. And now all of the birds of prey are coming down upon them. And they can't fight that. They can't shoo those birds away. And so here they are pecking at him. And where do you think the birds would begin to peck first? This was one of the things that the Romans had just so profoundly had accomplished in making this such a horrible, horrible way of dying that people would observe this and say, man, I don't want to cross Rome because that might happen to me. So what they would do is it would start with the softest parts of the body, which generally first was the eye. And so there would be the pecking of these birds of prey. And all of this is going on because a lot of times, a lot of these people who hung up on a cross would hang up there for days before they actually died. Now, in the case of Jesus, Jesus died very quickly. In fact, in Mark's gospel, Mark points out how that Pilate was surprised he was dead so fast. But a lot of these guys would just linger for a long period of time, and they are being tortured by just about every kind of bugs, birds, everything, as they are hanging there until finally they die. And then, once they took the body off the cross, because these are convicted criminals against Rome, they didn't give them a grave, a decent grave. There was just some kind of a pit that they would take and toss the bodies in. Now again, none of that happened to Jesus. But imagine the two criminals sitting next to him. I suspect that's what happened to those guys. Now their death was hastened because the Sabbath was upon them. And so they broke their legs to make it impossible for them to be able to get any kind of to sort of stand as best they could in order to be able to breathe out. Because crucifixion, you died by suffocation. You couldn't breathe. And so it was just a horrible way to die. Well, this is what they're wanting to have happen to Jesus. Well, I'm not so sure that they were necessarily wanting him to be crucified. They just wanted him dead. And they knew they couldn't kill him because they would have taken him out and stoned him to death because that's what the law said. But they're going to get Rome to do it, and Rome, because of the nature of the crime that Jesus would be convicted of, that is, making himself a king, a threat, therefore, to the very foundation of what the Roman Empire was all about, and that is the Caesar himself, he, therefore, is going to be made an example of, and they would crucify him. And it would be just a horrible way to die. Okay, so they had to come up with that, and we'll explore that a little bit more. Okay, go ahead, John. That's true. They did kill other people. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good observation. That really is a good observation, because it could be that what they're trying to do is to put it all on Rome. We didn't kill him, Rome killed him. But although through this whole ordeal that's going through, you know, the Jewish leaders are egging the people on to make sure that that Pilate is not going to allow Jesus to walk free. Even after beating him, that's not sufficient. They want him dead. Okay, and I think you're right, John, that, well, I forget what you first said. What was the first thing you said? But I do remember thinking, you're right. Right. And so maybe it could be qualified this way. He was such a prominent figure. And prominent figures were rarely taken out and executed. I mean, when you look at, for instance, the stoning of Stephen, you know, over there in the book of Acts, Stephen wasn't really known very well. He was just kind of a marginalized sort of a guy, and they just took him out and killed him. So yeah, they did do that. But when you're dealing with a prominent figure like Jesus, and especially at the period of time it was, and because of the kind of what am I trying to say? The kind of attention that he had gotten from the entire Jewish population. It would have been really, really difficult for the Jewish leaders to kill him in a way that would not eventually wind up in a riot. And so I think that your observation is a good observation, and that is they're trying to kind of clean themselves off of this and just blame it on Rome for doing all of this kind of stuff, even though they're the ones that perpetrated it. They did it all in the first place. Okay, so he is delivered to Pilate, and they bring him with this charge, a charge that Pilate is trying to get more clarification on this. He wants more explanation. So he actually brings Jesus in and gives him an audience and trying to figure all this stuff out. And how does Jesus respond to it? I mean, really, John is the only one who tells us that Jesus even said anything to Pilate. And that was when Pilate said, "Are you a king?" That's recorded over in John chapter 18. And Jesus said, "Yes, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. Because if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered into the hands of the Jews." Well, even then, according to John's account of this, Pilate recognized this guy's not a threat. And that's one of the observations that I have down here in my notes. Pilate may have thought Jesus was crazy, but he didn't think he was a threat to Rome. But that wasn't going to cut it, because even though Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus, the Jews did. And they were going to do that as the Jewish leadership did. And so Pilate tried every way he could think of to prevent Jesus from being executed, but the Jews, the Jews would just have none of that. And they recognized, that is, Pilate recognized that there is a riot that is about to take place here. And that is one thing he doesn't want. Because if a riot begins in an area that is already a hotbed, then all that's going to do is bring all of the attention of the Roman leaders up in Rome. It's going to bring all that attention to Pilate, and Pilate's going to lose his position. Well, ultimately he did. Pilate was just a sorry individual. But anyway, Pilate is thinking, well, this has got to be taken care of, because if it's not taken care of, there's going to be a riot. It's all going to fall on me. And so what he does is essentially, in order to pacify the crowd, this mob of people, he delivered Jesus over to be crucified. Okay, so Pilate was not, you can look him up and you can find out he was not a good leader at all. He was a pretty sorry leader, as a matter of fact. My understanding is that eventually he was exiled to some island and he died there. Some people say he was assassinated while he was there, but whatever the case, Pilate was just not a good guy. And he sure didn't have any kind of backbone, because he would not, even though he knew Jesus was innocent, he would not set him free. So he's delivered him over to be crucified. Okay, so when we get to the last half then, the last part of Mark chapter 15, the first thing he did was he scourged him. And the scourging, what can you tell me about that? Yeah. Yeah. Right. And they had little pieces of glass and rock and bone and things like that. At the end of what was it wasn't just a whip, it was a bunch of whips. And they had all this stuff, like a cat of nine tails. And they had all these things tied on, and as they're whipping him, they're whipping the person who was receiving this kind of a scourging. The flesh would be cut open to the bone. It was just brutal, the scourging itself. Yes, Chris? Yeah, that would be a good, if you've ever seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, you get a kind of a taste of what it must have been like. When Jesus went to the cross, he was a bloody mess. It would not have been like the way that it has been kind of, what am I trying to say? Kind of, there's a word I'm looking for and I don't know what it is. Well, made cleaner. Sanitized, that's the word I'm looking for. It's not the sanitized version you see of Jesus hanging up there. His body is just, it just is like a normal body with a loincloth on. Now, he would have been naked and he would have been bleeding out of probably every place. The scourging itself was so brutal. And the reason why they did that was to hasten the individual's death, so that once they put him on the cross, he'd already let out so much blood that, and you know, the blood, obviously, you bleed out, you're going to die. So he would have been just a horrible mess. And he continues to be further humiliated and degraded, particularly now by the Roman soldiers, which, by the way, from what I was reading about this was something that they always wanted to do. They wanted to kill the King of the Jews. They hated the Jews. And the men who were taken from their particular area of armor, or how they served in the army, or whatever they called themselves, the legions, they did not want to go to this part of the world. They felt like that was some kind of a demotion to be sent down to this part of the world. And the reason is because it was so volatile. It was just a hotbed of just all kinds of horrible things that were going on. And the reason why was because the Jews were a people who did not want to be occupied by Rome. And so it was just a terrible thing to even be sent down there. And so they always wanted to kill the King of the Jews, since they had this great hatred for him. And so as a result, they just joined right in with all of this. They're humiliating him, they're degrading him, and he's weakened to the point that he's almost dead, and he couldn't carry the crossbeam of the cross. Now, I know, again, a lot of times people have the idea Jesus carried his cross. And again, from what I've read about crucifixion, they did not carry the upper part of the cross. They just carried the crossbeam, and it was generally strapped around their shoulders. And they would carry that, and then once they got to the place, then they would lay him down and nail all of those things to the upper beam, and nail the individual to both the crossbeam and the upper beam. So he's carrying the crossbeam, and he is so weakened by what has already happened that he falls. He can't carry it. And so there's this man, Simon of Cyrene, who was compelled to carry it. And you know, interestingly enough, Mark mentions who his father and I think his father and his he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, Alexander and Rufus are mentioned later in places in the New Testament. And many people believe that these guys became Christians. Now, whether that's the case or not, I don't know if I would be compelled to come to that conclusion. But nonetheless, this Simon of Cyrene, this is not, like a lot of people might think, this is some kind of an honor. No, this is not an honor. This is just total humiliation of Simon, because he's got to carry this guy's cross. And so he's compelled to carry it. And finally, after having arrived at the place of execution, this place called Golgotha or Golgotha, or some would say it's Calvary. Golgotha is a Greek word, and Calvary is a Latin word, and they mean the same thing, and that is the place of the skull. And there Jesus is crucified between these two criminals. And all the while, he's continuing to be mocked and humiliated, including by these criminals. At least both of them initially started. One of them, as Luke records, changed his ways. But nonetheless, he hung there being mocked and humiliated until he finally died. Now, there's a lot that can be said about it, and we really don't have time to get into it. And that's, again, not really the purpose of all of this. But what I want to note here is something that happened after Jesus died, and he breathed out his last. And that's found in verse 38 of chapter 15. Verse 37 says that Jesus uttered a loud cry and he breathed his last. And now here is this phenomenon that occurs. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, what curtain of the temple do you think this is talking about? Okay. Between the holy place, that's the only place a curtain hung in the temple, was between the holy and the most holy place. What is in the most holy place? Well, in these days, there was no ark. There was just a big stone that was in there that commemorated the ark, because the ark probably had been melted down during the Babylonian times. But whatever the case, what did the inside, the holiest of holies, represent? Okay, it's the dwelling place of God. That's what it was. From the very inception of the tabernacle, through all of the temples that were built, both First Temple Judaism and then what's called Second Temple Judaism, it was recognized that that is the dwelling place of God upon earth. And so the temple curtain is ripped in two. And I ask you a question about that. What do you think that that was all about? Okay. It is now, that's right, as Cindy pointed out, it is now providing access to God. Access that, as David pointed out, the high priest could only enter into that place. He's the only one that could enter into it, and he could only enter into it one time a year, and that was it. And he didn't dawdle when he was in there. In fact, my understanding was it was such a scary thing for the high priest to do that they actually tied a rope around his waist when he went into the holiest of holies to do the sacrificing that he was to do. And they tied that rope around him in case he died while he was in there, and they could pull him out because they weren't going in after him. So this was a place that was considered to be absolutely sacred. It was the sanctum sanctorum, the holiest of holies, because it was considered to be the dwelling place of God. And so, by virtue of this temple curtain being torn in two, what is being declared here is that the temple age is finished. It's done with. A new age is coming into existence. God's kingdom has come. And from now on, access into the presence of God is no longer through the Jewish temple, but access into the presence of God is through the temple of the body of Jesus. And it's an access that is open to all, made possible by His death, all to who would come to God through Jesus. Cynthia. Right. That's right. That's clear that this is something, nobody was in there tearing this. This was God doing this from top to bottom, signifying God's place to the earth. David, did you have your hand up? Okay. No. Yeah. Right. Right. No, this was a phenomenon that was caused by God. And it's a sign of something. It's a signal of something. And as I said, the way that I would interpret it is that it is the signal that the temple age is done. And now access to God is being provided through Christ. And the only way that we can come into the presence of God is through the body of Christ, through what He did, through His death, as He died upon the cross, opening the way up for all people to be able now to come into the very presence of God. Okay, so we need to hasten through this. Jesus' ministry as a servant has now reached its completion. And as John records this, Jesus, some of the last, if not the very last words that He said before He died was, "It is finished," meaning that it is completed. So He gave His life as a ransom for many, bringing in the new age, bringing in the kingdom of God, making it possible now for all sinful humanity to be set free from sin and to have access to God through Christ for those who would believe and who would follow Him. That's the profoundness of what took place. And we've just really touched a tip of what can be delved into so deeply as far as the significance of all of the things that occurred around it. But time forces us to move on. Okay, so Jesus is now dead. And when we get to the last part of the 15th chapter, it's time for Him to be buried. Okay, so He dies around, it says the 9th hour, which would have been about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. It is, the Sabbath is about to begin at 6 p.m. So if I do my math correctly, let's see, 6 minus 3 is 3. They have 3 hours to take Him off the cross and to get everything all prepared. They had to go in. They had to go into the town because this was outside of Jerusalem. They have to go into Jerusalem. They have to get some type of a cloak or whatever to wrap His body up in. And Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin Council, but it's obvious when you know about him that he did not agree with what was going on. He was actually a secret disciple of Jesus, and he took a great risk. And he goes to Pilate, and he asks Pilate for the body of Jesus so he could bury it. Now, he takes a great risk because if there's a guy who has just been murdered for a particular crime that is who had just been executed for a crime that is so egregious, and somebody comes along and says, "Can I have the body so that I can take care of it?" What would the authorities just naturally assume about the guy who said, "Can I take that body?" That he's a part of it. Yeah, he's a part of this whole thing. Okay, so Joseph of Arimathea is taking a huge risk here, but he does it anyway. And as I said, Pilate was amazed he was dead so soon, and Pilate agreed to allow at least to give him some kind of a decent burial. And so Joseph of Arimathea, and I believe he is helped by the women who followed Jesus through his earthly ministry, which seems to be indicated in the last part because it talks about at least two of the ladies knew exactly where he was being laid. They had to work fast because it's the beginning of the Sabbath. And so they're working as fast as they can. He gets this permission. They have to go buy this shroud in order to wrap the body up. They have to take his body down from the cross. They have to wrap it up. They have to lay him in a tomb. That's a lot to do. They have to anoint the body or at least treat it with spices. And that's not enough time. 3 hours is not enough time. And I like the way the one individual put this. He said, "The Sabbath is upon him and everything must now rest, including the body of Jesus." Okay, so that brings us then to when the Sabbath is finally over, on the first day of the next week, which brings us then to this final lesson. How significant is the resurrection of Christ? Okay. And why is it, for us personally, why would that be? Randy? Okay. Okay, all you have is a dead Messiah. That's all you have. Well, those were a dime a dozen. There were a lot of people, and Jesus even talked about that. A lot of these people would come around claiming that there were people who claimed they were the Messiah before Jesus came. And they were killed, and they stayed dead. Okay. So the resurrection, and this goes to what John is talking about. Particularly, you see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I gave you that as a reference in the question that I had. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is not arguing for the resurrection of Christ per se. He's arguing for the resurrection, period. And what he points out is that if there is no resurrection, then Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. And if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, what does that say about our faith? Our faith is worthless. It's absolutely worthless. The resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of the Christian faith. Without the resurrection of Christ, there is no such thing as Christianity. That's how significant this is. And so what we are seeing now in Mark's account is the shortest of all of the gospel writers' account of the resurrection of Jesus. And what we see here is that the women on the first day of the week, it's the early morning hours of the first day of the week, he notes that 3 women, at least 2 of them, all 3 of them had witnessed the crucifixion. 2 of them, at least, were familiar with where he had been laid, and they had purchased some spices, and they were going to go in and they were going to anoint the dead body of Jesus. This task, by the way, would be done initially at any entombment of any person who had died, or and for whatever reason, and would then be put inside this tomb. But because it was the Sabbath, it could not be completed. And so the purpose of all of this, as was the custom of the burial in ancient days, was to spice up the body so as to mitigate essentially the smell of the decomposition of the body itself. And there's a reason for that. Why would you think, and this might address a little bit about your knowledge of the ancient burials and how they did things. Why do you think that they would go to such big measures. I mean, we don't do that. We might embalm the body or something like that, but you don't see people putting all kinds of good-smelling stuff all over the dead body. We just wrap it up in a coffin and drop it in the ground, or maybe in a mausoleum or something like that. Why would they do something like this? Leslie. That's right. The tombs were never intended to just house one dead body. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is a tomb that nobody had ever been buried in yet. So Jesus is the first. Okay, so the whole point of this then was the fact that in the ancient days, it would take about a year for the body to completely decompose, and then all that would be left would essentially be the skeleton. And then what they would do is at the end of that year, they would go back into the tomb, they would take those bones, that's all that's left, and they would have what was called an ossuary. It's a little box about like this. And they would take all of the bones and they would put them inside that ossuary, and then they'd put it up on a shelf somewhere. Okay, so most of the time these tombs were family tombs. And this is what they would do. Now, if somebody died, just say like maybe a few months after Jesus had died, and he had not been resurrected from the dead, what's his body going to be like? It's going to just reek to high heaven. And so these spices were put there for the purpose of mitigating that, solely for the purpose of basically, how can I phrase it? That they were just being polite to the people who would bring in the next body, so that they didn't have to smell that foulness. I'm sure they could still smell it, but it would be mixed with something that would be a little bit more tolerable. And that's the way they did things. And that's how they would do it until the body decomposed, and then they put it in the ossuary, and it just went on and on and on like that. Okay, so that's what this is all about. That's the reason why they were so anxious to get back there and prepare the body by putting these spices on it. Okay, now what we need really to especially note here is, why were the women going back to the tomb? In other words, what were they intending to do, and what were they not expecting? They did not expect it. They had no idea that the concept of resurrection was something that was so. It may have been within their understanding of their metaphysics, but they didn't expect Jesus to be raised from the dead. They expected him to be dead. And so they went there with the purpose of treating the body. Now that's profound, because nobody expects him to be raised from the dead. And they arrive at the tomb, and once they get to the tomb, there is this great shock. By the way, what are they thinking when they're going back to the tomb? Who's going to move the stone? They're not thinking, is his body going to be in there? That never crossed their mind. What crosses their minds is, how are we going to get in there? How are we going to get this stone moved away from the tomb? Well, when they get there, they have the shock of their life. The stone is rolled away, and Jesus' body isn't there. Okay, and then there's this man in white, most likely this was an angel, who begins a conversation with him. And basically what this young man who is dressed in white is telling them is that they don't need to be alarmed, because the one whom they were seeking had been raised from the dead. And then they were given the responsibility of taking this message back to the disciples and to tell them that they would see him again in Galilee. And note here, Peter especially is specifically mentioned in Mark's account. There are a lot of people who say, well, that's because Peter had the primacy. And I don't believe that's it at all. I think more so, at least to me, a more convincing argument is the reason why Peter is specifically mentioned is because Peter needed to be assured, after his 3 devastating denials, that he is not regarded as being beyond redemption. So he wants to meet all of them, including Peter. So these women left the tomb, fearful and astonished at what they had just witnessed. A resurrection that was totally unexpected. Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, so let me go through this real quickly with what my notes I have here. By the way, verses 9 through 20 of Mark chapter 16 has been referred to as being spurious, and that is the case for at least 1,000 years. And I am not going to enter into that debate. First of all, we only have 5 minutes left, so I couldn't really enter into that debate even if I wanted to. But the fact is, some people believe that this was actually penned by some copyists who were not satisfied with Mark's ending. Some believe it was Mark who ended it, who came and added this appendix a little bit later on. It doesn't matter. And by the way, if you're really interested in what I think is it's a very shallow, but it's a good analysis of this. If you have the English Standard Version Study Bible, they do a really good job in talking about this. There's a very, it's not real lengthy, but it's a good article about this last section of Mark's Gospel. But anyway, there are 3 appearances that occur in this section. The appearance, first of all, to Mary Magdalene, then he appears to 2 disciples. Most likely it's the disciples that Luke refers to in Luke chapter 24. And then finally he appears to the 11. But before he actually appears to the 11, he's got Mary, and then he has these 2 disciples, and they go back and tell these men who had followed Jesus throughout his earthly ministry, he's risen from the dead. And what's their reaction? They don't believe it. They don't believe it. Folks, I'm telling you, resurrection was not on their radar. It just was not something that they were thinking of. And I believe, personally, that this is one of the great, more powerful historical proofs of the resurrection of Christ. Because these were men who had initially been prepared for what actually happened because Jesus told them it was going to happen, but they didn't understand it. And after all that Jesus had predicted finally happened, they finally, their reaction to it is that they refused to believe it despite the reliable testimony that had been given. And the only thing that was going to convince them is to see Him Himself. And so Jesus appears to them. And what does Jesus do? Okay. That's right. He rebuked them. Because they've got these reliable witnesses telling them, and they refuse to believe. So Jesus rebukes them for what they've done. And I think that what this does is, again, at least in my mind, it really does, at least for me, it convicts me even more that the resurrection had occurred. Because if it had not occurred, then none of these men who initially doubted it would have ever spent the rest of their lives testifying to the truth of it, which would eventually cost them their own lives, if in fact the resurrection had not happened. These were not men looking for a resurrection. And I think that that's profound, because when they saw Him, well, that removed all doubt. Now they are convinced He has been raised from the dead. Okay, so the last part of Mark is basically His commission to His disciples. He tells them about the signs that would accompany them, which we could say a lot about that, but again, we don't have time. Jesus then ascends, and He's exalted into His position of being at the right hand of the Father. And as we bring this to its conclusion, He has taken His rightful place now as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, having been given universal power in heaven and on earth. And it's no wonder then that these men went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and through them, telling the good news of God's kingdom, having arrived in Jesus and the salvation that is made possible only through Him. The new age has arrived, and those who come to God through faith in Him will share in it. That is the kind of servant that has come to earth. And so as we bring this to its conclusion, as we strive to live the kind of life that Jesus said in Mark 10, verse 44, how that we are to be like Him. We are to serve, not to be served. And as we strive to live that way, living lives of sacrificial service, we do so with faith and trust in the limitless power and the ultimate triumph of our great King who came to this earth, lived, suffered, died on a cross, was resurrected, and exalted to his Father's right hand, all of this done in service to his Father and in service to mankind. So I hope that you've gotten at least that out of it, the kind of service that Jesus manifested throughout his life, and how that he is the prototype, he is the archetype of servant. And that is what we need to be striving to emulate. All right, next week, start a study on the subject of prayer. Thank you all for your time and your participation throughout this entire period. Appreciate it very much.